What if the Viking world was not held together by courage, or weapons, or even belief, but by something far less romantic, the ability to stay dry, to stay fed, and to stay warm when the mathematics of winter turned against you? That sounds too ordinary to explain a people who crossed oceans and frightened kingdoms, yet the evidence keeps pushing us back to this uncomfortable contradiction. In the north, the most dangerous enemy was not another tribe with a sharper axe, but a season that arrived on schedule and killed without intent. Here is the paradox that history rarely says out loud. The Vikings were famous for taking risks at sea, but the smartest Viking decision was often to avoid risk completely, to refuse the sea, to refuse the road, and to shrink life down to the smallest possible circle until spring returned. If that is true, then the heroic picture of constant motion collapses, and a more unsettling question replaces it. How did a culture built on reputation and action survive a season that punished action, where a single wet sleeve could become a death sentence long before any battle began? A modern instinct tells us that survival in cold is mostly a matter of toughness, and that the people who lived there must have been naturally hardened, almost immune. It is a comforting belief, because it keeps the past neatly separated from us. They were built differently, so their hardships cannot happen to us. But bodies do not negotiate with physics. Heat leaves flesh the same way it leaves any warm object, and wind and water accelerate that loss with indifference. Archaeology does not show superhuman cold resistance. It shows systems designed to reduce exposure. When you look closely at what survives in the ground, you find the tools of a culture that understood limits. Wool fibers that trap air, hides chosen not for status but for how they shed spray, seams tightened in ways that reduce drafts, and living spaces arranged to minimize wasted warmth. The paradox here is that Viking strength was often the opposite of bravado. It was an acceptance that the human body is fragile and cold, and that morale does not keep your core temperature stable. Once you see winter not as scenery but as a predictable energy problem, many Viking choices stop looking like tradition and start looking like engineering. Another common assumption is that the Viking longhouse was simply a big room with a fire in it, a crude shelter that worked because any shelter is better than none. That assumption fails the moment you treat a house as a machine for controlling airflow. A hearth produces heat, yes, but it also produces smoke, and smoke forces you to build an exit. The intuitive modern solution is to vent aggressively, to clear the air fast, to make the interior feel fresh. Yet in winter, that same freshness is a leak, and a leak is a slow execution. The longhouse, in many reconstructions and in the logic of its form, solves a contradiction. It must let smoke escape without letting the stored heat escape with it. So you see roof openings that act like narrow throats rather than wide chimneys, and interior volumes shaped not for comfort by modern standards, but for heat behavior. Warm air rises, collects, and wants to leave. The roofline and the confined exits force a slower exchange. The counterintuitive conclusion is that the goal was not to make the air clean, but to make it stable. This is not romantic. It is a compromise that would offend our expectations of hygiene, and that is precisely why it worked. In the Viking winter, perfect living conditions were less important than conditions that did not kill you. We also tend to believe that clothing is secondary, the final layer of protection after the real work is done by shelter and fire. That belief is modern, because we can outsource warmth to engines, to heaters, to endless fuel, and we assume warmth is something produced rather than conserved. But in the North Atlantic world, warmth was conserved or lost, and clothing was the front line where physics met the skin. The paradox is that the strongest ship, the best longhouse, and the bravest crew could still be undone by a small failure in textile work. Seams matter, fiber matters. The way wool behaves when damp matters. The way a hide sheds water matters. The work of spinning, weaving, stitching, and repairing was not domestic background noise. It was strategic infrastructure. The evidence for this lives in the quiet places. Textile tools, needles, scraps, the wear patterns on equipment, and the cultural emphasis on maintaining what you already own. A modern mind often separates war and home, but the Viking winter erased that separation. The conclusion that feels backwards to us is that the most decisive winter technology was not a weapon or a boat, but the disciplined control of layers, moisture, and wind penetration maintained day after day by people whose names were rarely carved into sagas. Many people imagine Viking winter food as a rough, abundant feast, a culture of constant meat and drink that kept spirits high until spring. It is an appealing story, because it turns hardship into a kind of hearty romance. But winter is not impressed by appetite. The real contradiction was that the season arrived after the harvest window closed, when fresh calories were hardest to obtain, and yet the body needed more energy to stay warm, not less. Archaeology and historical logic point to a survival economy built on preservation, not on abundance. Drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, storing grains, and turning limited resources into meals that stretched. Stews and soups become not just cuisine, but thermoregulation, because hot liquids deliver warmth while requiring fewer rare ingredients than roasted meat. Even alcohol, often imagined as warming, becomes ambiguous under scrutiny, because it can create a feeling of heat while increasing heat loss in dangerous conditions. The counterintuitive conclusion is that winter survival depended less on heroic consumption and more on restraint, planning, and monotony. The Viking winter table was not a celebration, it was a schedule, and schedules, more than courage, are what keep a household alive when daylight shrinks and work outside becomes a gamble. A modern audience often assumes that Vikings traveled constantly, raided constantly, and that movement itself was a kind of natural state. The popular image is kinetic: ships, sails, open horizons, yet winter punishes movement with compounding risks. The paradox is that a seafaring culture had to become, for long stretches, a culture of staying put. The sea that carried reputation and wealth also carried cold water that could kill in minutes. A wooden vessel, sealed and pitched, becomes a floating trap. You cannot safely light a fire, you cannot dry clothing easily, and the moment you are soaked, your odds collapse. Here, the logic of experience over strength becomes more than a dramatic line. It is a statistical truth in a landscape where one bad decision can cascade. Fatigue leads to mistakes, mistakes lead to wetness, wetness leads to hypothermia, and hypothermia steals judgment before it steals life. The counterintuitive conclusion is that the Vikings' maritime skill was not simply the ability to go, but the ability to decide when not to go, to read weather as a series of thresholds, and to accept that the ocean does not reward pride. Their boldness was real, but it was bounded. The myth of constant motion fades, and what remains is a culture making difficult risk calculations with limited information and no second chances. Another assumption is that danger in the Viking world came mostly from violence between people. That is partly true, but it hides a deeper contradiction. In winter, threats multiply from sources that do not negotiate. Predators, injuries, infections, storms, and accidents become more lethal because the margin for recovery disappears. A bite that might be survivable in summer can become fatal in winter, not because medicine is absent, but because the body cannot afford extra energy loss, and because clean, warm recovery spaces are limited. The historical record and the logic of pre-modern life suggest that crews and households lived with a constant awareness of attrition. People died without a dramatic cause, from exhaustion, from exposure, from cascading weakness. This is not a moral tale. It is a reminder that survival is often decided by unglamorous variables. The counterintuitive conclusion is that combat readiness in winter was not primarily about fighting skill, but about staying functional, keeping hands working, keeping feet intact, keeping skin from breaking down, keeping routines that prevented small problems from becoming irreversible. When you view winter as an amplifier of small failures, you begin to see why Viking communities invested so heavily in repair culture and why the waiting season was filled with sharpening, mending, and preparing, as if the true battle was against entropy. It is also easy to assume that Viking raids were driven by aggression first and necessity second, as if violence was simply an expression of identity. But Winter complicates that story by introducing a grim economic contradiction. If you raid for supplies, you are gambling the lives of experienced men, and those men are themselves the most valuable winter resource a community possesses. Lose them, and you may return with food, but without the hands and knowledge needed to survive the season. Archaeology cannot always tell us the precise motives behind a specific voyage, but the broader logic is clear. In a subsistence world, a smaller larder is not just hunger, it is a countdown. And yet, the act of fixing that shortage through travel creates a new shortage: loss of manpower, loss of skill, loss of stability. The counterintuitive conclusion is that raids, when they occurred in harsh seasons, may have been less about glory than about triage, a desperate attempt to stabilize one system by borrowing from another, even when the interest rate was paid in blood and exhaustion. This does not excuse violence, and it does not sanctify it. It simply places it inside the cold arithmetic of survival, where choices are made not because they are good, but because the alternatives are worse. Modern viewers often imagine Viking society as tightly organized, with clear roles. Warriors fight, craftsmen build, women maintain the home, elders advise. The story feels tidy. Winter, however, creates a contradiction that breaks tidy roles. Specialization collapses under attrition. If you lose men, the oars still need pulling. If a seam fails, someone must mend it. If a tool breaks, someone must repair it. In extreme conditions, competence matters more than identity. The evidence for this is not a single artifact, but the way survival cultures behave when pressed. Roles blur, and the community becomes a flexible organism. The most successful groups are not the ones with the strongest individuals, but the ones with redundancy, the ones who can absorb loss without losing function. This is where the older, quieter truths of Viking life become visible. A widowed man who learns to stitch is not an anomaly. He is a sign of adaptability. A household that teaches multiple people to preserve food is not sentimental. It is preventing disaster. The counterintuitive conclusion is that Viking resilience was not built on heroic perfection, but on distributed competence, on the uncelebrated ability to fill gaps when the expected person is gone. We usually expect history to end with clarity, as if the past owes us a lesson we can pin to a wall. But the Viking winter does not offer that kind of closure. What it offers is a quieter truth that sits under the drama, the kind that older documentary films used to trust an audience to carry without being told what to feel. In the stories we inherit, the chieftain returns to see smoke, the Longhouse is burning, the coastline flickers, and suddenly winter no longer matters because another kind of fire has taken its place. It is tempting to treat this as pure narrative momentum, a hook into vengeance and action. Yet if we step back, the deeper pattern is almost the opposite. What breaks people is rarely one grand enemy you can strike down. It is the accumulation of small limits ignored too long. The wet sleeve, the exhausted night watch, the shrinking daylight, the storehouse that is not as full as it should be, the body that finally fails without a wound. In that sense, the Viking world survives in the most human way possible, not through triumph, but through recognition. They endured because they understood what could not be changed, and they built their lives around that truth, even when it meant monotony, compromise, and silence for months at a time. The past continues not because it is glorious, but because ordinary people kept learning where the edge was and stopped stepping past it. If this story touches something in your own family history, not the romance of conquest, but the reality of endurance, you might think of the winters your grandparents described, the moves made with little money, the work done with tired hands, the kind of adaptation that never made headlines but kept a home standing. If you feel comfortable, share a memory like that below, a moment when someone in your family endured a season that could not be argued with and found a way through it anyway.